Faith can be a beautiful light in the darkest moments, but it can also become the cruelest weapon when someone uses it to manipulate vulnerable souls. My mother was a devout woman who had spent 40 years of her life serving our church, giving her time, her money, her heart to this community. And when cancer caught up with her at 68, when doctors told her she only had a few months to live, she turned to her faith with even more fervor. She wanted to leave in peace, reconciled with God, certain she had done good around her. Pastor Bernard, this man the entire parish venerated as a saint, saw in her distress not a soul to comfort but an opportunity to exploit. He manipulated my dying mother into giving him almost everything she owned, under the pretext of saving her soul and ensuring her entry into heaven. When I discovered what he had done, I understood that some betrayals don't deserve forgiveness but the most implacable justice. Subscribe to follow this story and leave your reactions in the comments. My name is Claire, I'm 42 years old, and 2 years ago, I lost my mother under circumstances that broke my heart. Not just because of the cancer that took her, but because of what a man she trusted absolutely did to her during her final months. My mother, Monica, had been a widow for 15 years. My father had died of a heart attack, leaving her alone with a small pension and the family home they had bought together. She lived modestly but comfortably. Our church, St. Paul's, was the center of her social and spiritual life. She went 3 times a week, participated in all events, helped organize fundraisers, visited the sick in the parish. Pastor Bernard had arrived 5 years before my mother's diagnosis. He was a charismatic man in his 50s, with a deep, reassuring voice. He had this gift of making everyone feel special, chosen, loved by God. The community adored him. I lived 2 hours away, had my own family, my job. I saw my mother about once a month, we talked on the phone regularly. When the diagnosis came, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the doctors were clear. 6 months, maybe a year with chemotherapy. My mother was devastated at first, then she found comfort in her faith. She told me it was God's will, that she had to accept it with serenity. Pastor Bernard came to see her regularly at the hospital, then at home when she returned. He prayed with her, read the Bible, comforted her. I found it normal, even touching. It was his role as a pastor after all. What I didn't know was that during these visits, he gave her a completely different speech when I was absent. He talked to her about the necessity of purifying herself before death, of redeeming her sins, of making acts of generosity to guarantee her eternal salvation. My mother, weakened by illness and fear of death, drank in his words. She asked him what she should do. And he, with his benevolent smile and reassuring voice, suggested she make significant donations to the church. That this was what God expected of her. The first donations were modest. A few $100s here and there. Then the amounts increased. $1,000, $2,000. My mother was drawing from her savings, from the small life insurance my father had left her. I knew nothing about any of this. She didn't talk to me about it, probably because the pastor had told her that true charity is done in secret, that only God should know. 3 months before her death, my mother called me one evening. She sounded strange on the phone, both excited and anxious. She told me she had made a big decision, that she was going to do something important for her salvation. I tried to get her to be more specific, but she remained vague. She just said that Pastor Bernard was helping her prepare for her passage to the afterlife, that it was a great blessing to have him in her life. 2 weeks later, I received a call from my mother's lawyer. He wanted to see me urgently. I took a day off and went to his office. What he told me that day chilled my blood. My mother had modified her will. She was leaving her house, worth about $300,000, directly to St. Paul's Church. More specifically, to Pastor Bernard as representative of the church. She had also emptied her bank account, transferring the $40,000 that remained of her savings to the church's account. The lawyer confided that he had found it strange, that he had tried to dissuade my mother, to suggest she at least leave me something. But she had insisted, saying it was God's will, that the pastor had explained to her that this was the only way to guarantee her entry into heaven. That her earthly possessions should return to the church. The lawyer had doubts about my mother's capacity to make such a decision, given her health condition and the medications she was taking. But legally, she was still considered competent. I left that office in shock. I went directly to my mother's house. She was in bed, very weak. I asked her if it was true, if she had really given everything to the church. She smiled weakly at me and said yes, that Pastor Bernard had explained that this was what God expected of her. That her sins were numerous and she had to make this sacrifice to be forgiven. That the house and money would be used to do good, to help the poor, to serve God. I asked her what sins she had committed that required such a sacrifice. She murmured confused things about youthful mistakes, about moments when she had lacked faith. Nothing concrete, just the vague guilt we all feel. I understood that the pastor had exploited this guilt, amplified it, manipulated it to convince her to give everything. I tried to make her understand that she had been manipulated, that God wasn't asking her to abandon her daughter and grandchildren to enrich a pastor. But she was too weak, too indoctrinated. She begged me to understand, not to go against God's will. I left that evening in tears, furious but powerless. The next day, I went to the church. Pastor Bernard was in his office. When I entered, he greeted me with his usual warm smile, asking about my mother. I told him I knew everything, that he had manipulated a dying woman to extort all her possessions. His smile froze. He calmly replied that my mother had made her decisions freely, guided by her faith. That the church would use these donations to do good, as she wished. That I shouldn't let my attachment to material goods blind me to spiritual matters. I wanted to scream, hit him, call the police. But I knew that legally, it was complicated. My mother had signed the documents in front of the lawyer. She was considered lucid. The pastor had left no written trace of his manipulations. It was his word against mine. And in this community, his word was gold. I left his office promising him he would pay for what he had done. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. My mother died 6 weeks later. Her final days were peaceful. She was convinced she had made the right choice, had ensured her eternal salvation. This illusion at least allowed her to leave serenely. I was torn between my sadness at losing her and my rage against the one who had stripped her. At the funeral, Pastor Bernard gave a magnificent eulogy about my mother, speaking of her generosity, her unwavering faith, her ultimate gift to the church. Parishioners cried, touched by his words. I sat in the front row, clenching my fists, already planning my revenge. After the burial, I began my research. I contacted other church members, discreetly. I asked questions about Pastor Bernard, about his activities, about the use of church funds. And I discovered that my mother wasn't the only one. Over the 5 years of the pastor's presence, 3 other elderly people had died, leaving significant sums to the church. Always under his guidance, always appealing to their faith and fear of damnation. I found the families of these people. Like me, they had been shocked, hurt, but they hadn't been able to do anything. The pastor was too respected, too protected by the community. Together, we decided to act. We hired a private detective to investigate Pastor Bernard. What he discovered exceeded our worst fears. The pastor was using the money to finance his personal lifestyle. He owned a luxury apartment in another city, which he had bought with the donations. He traveled regularly in first class, stayed in luxury hotels, all while claiming to attend religious conferences. He also had a companion, a woman he saw regularly and to whom he gave expensive gifts. All financed by money extorted from vulnerable elderly people. With this evidence in hand, I decided the time for revenge had come. But I didn't want to simply report him to the authorities. I wanted him exposed before the entire community he had deceived, before all those people who venerated him. I wanted to destroy his reputation publicly, as he had destroyed the end of my mother's life. One Sunday morning, during the main service when the church was packed, I showed up with the 3 other victim families. We had prepared a complete file with all the evidence, bank statements showing money transfers, photos of the pastor's luxury apartment, receipts from his first-class travels, testimony from his companion. We also had written testimonies from relatives of the deceased explaining how the pastor had manipulated them. In the middle of his sermon, I stood up. Pastor Bernard stopped, surprised. I asked to speak. He tried to politely refuse, saying we could talk after the service. But I insisted, my voice carrying throughout the church. I said the community needed to know who really was the man they called pastor. Then I began telling everything. How he had manipulated my dying mother to extort all her possessions. How he had done the same thing with 3 other elderly people. How he was using this money not for the church, not to help the poor, but to afford himself a life of luxury. I showed the evidence, had it circulated in the pews. Photos of his apartment, his travels, his companion. Pastor Bernard tried to interrupt me, to say these were lies, baseless accusations motivated by my greed. But the evidence spoke for itself. Parishioners looked at them, shocked, incredulous. Some were crying. Others stood up furious. The atmosphere in the church shifted from devotion to anger in minutes. The 3 other families stood up in turn, telling their own stories. How their loved ones had been manipulated in their final moments, stripped of their savings under the pretext of eternal salvation. How the pastor had exploited their faith, their fear of death, their vulnerability. Each testimony was a blow to the pastor's reputation. Then I pulled out the final piece of my file. A recording. I had managed to obtain a recording of a conversation between the pastor and another elderly woman in the parish, Mrs. Lawrence, who was sick. In this recording, you could clearly hear him tell her that her sins were so grave she risked hell if she didn't make a substantial donation to the church. That it would take at least $20,000 to redeem her soul. Mrs. Lawrence was sobbing, saying she didn't have that much money. And him, with his soft, reassuring voice, suggesting she sell her jewelry, take out a loan, find a way because her eternal salvation depended on it. I played the recording throughout the church, on the speakers. The silence was absolute. People listened, horrified. Some had their hands over their mouths. Others were crying openly. Pastor Bernard had turned white, frozen behind his pulpit. When the recording ended, someone shouted to call the police. Others began to stand up, surround him, demand explanations. The pastor tried to flee through the back door, but several men blocked him. The police arrived 15 minutes later, called by the church deacon who was also in shock. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Pastor Bernard was arrested and charged with abuse of weakness and fraud. The investigation revealed even more victims, even more diverted money. In total, he had extorted over $1 million from vulnerable parishioners over 5 years. Local then national media seized the case. The story of the manipulative pastor who robbed the dying shocked the entire country. The trial took place a year later. I testified, recounting what he had done to my mother. The other families testified too. Mrs. Lawrence, the one from the recording, came to tell how she had almost sold her house because of him. The pastor was sentenced to 8 years in prison. All the assets he had acquired with the stolen money were seized and sold. The money was redistributed to the victims' families. I got my mother's house back. Not all the money, part had already been spent, but at least the house. I sold it and used the money to create a foundation to help elderly people who are victims of scams. In memory of my mother, so that her sacrifice wouldn't be totally in vain. Subscribe now and leave your comments. I'd like to know what you think. St. Paul's Church survived the scandal, but with difficulty. Many parishioners left, disgusted, their faith shaken. A new pastor was appointed, someone recommended by the diocese, with an impeccable reputation. He's trying to rebuild the community, restore trust. It's a long process. Today, 2 years after my mother's death, I often think back to that period. To the pain of watching her die, amplified by the betrayal of someone she venerated. To my helpless rage in the face of this manipulation. And to my satisfaction at having managed to bring down this man, to expose him publicly, to have him convicted. My revenge was terrible, as I had promised him in his office that day. I didn't simply file a complaint discreetly. I destroyed his reputation before the entire community he had deceived. I humiliated him publicly before having him legally convicted. And I regret nothing. Pastor Bernard is in prison now. He lost his freedom, his reputation, everything he had built on the backs of his victims. In a few years, he'll get out, but he can never return to this region, never practice again. His name is now synonymous with betrayal, manipulation, cruelty toward the most vulnerable. My mother left thinking she had made the right choice, thinking she had guaranteed her salvation. I prefer to believe she's at peace now somewhere, and that she knows justice was done. That the man who betrayed her paid for his crimes. Not just legally, but morally, socially, definitively. If I had to give advice to families who see their elderly loved ones manipulated by religious authority figures or others, it would be this: don't stay silent. Gather evidence, find other victims, and expose these predators publicly. Public shame is sometimes the only possible justice, especially when the law is slow or insufficient. My mother didn't have the chance to see this man fall, but I had the satisfaction of bringing him down in her name. And that's already a lot.